He waited for years behind those icy metal bars as people passed his cell every day. As they selected puppies, their expressions brightened. As canines departed with their new family, ecstatic voices filled the air, papers were signed, and tails wagged, but nobody ever stopped for him. He had lost hope, but one day a couple appeared in front of his kennel and stared right at him. He initially believed they were inquisitive, but uninterested like everyone else. But then something strange occurred. They pointed toward him. When the worker nodded and the papers were signed, he realized he was leaving for home. However, nobody anticipated what happened next. Hunter had forgotten how much time he had spent in that refuge. Days seemed to go by quickly, followed by weeks, months, and what seemed like an eternity. He had initially been optimistic. He would leap to his feet, wag his tail, and press his nose against the metal bars whenever someone entered the adoption area. Though it was never, he longed and hoped that today would be the day. Too many dogs had come and gone, each one going off with a new family while he remained. Prior to him, the active puppies, small breeds, and even some older dogs were selected. He had made every effort to attract attention. He tried barking like the younger dogs, but that didn't work. He also tried sitting quietly and looking up with beseeching eyes, but that didn't work either. Finally, he just stopped trying. Now, when people passed by, he hardly raised his head. What was the point? The shelter was a noisy, chaotic place, where dogs barked all the time, the concrete floors were always cold, and the air smelled like disinfectant. Hunter never felt free, despite the volunteers who came and went to feed them, clean their cages, and occasionally take them for quick walks outdoors. His cage was small, just large enough for him to turn around in, and his food bowl was always full, but the kibble was dry and tasteless. He rarely experienced warmth other than when a staff member came by to scratch behind his ears. But that was another life, one that felt like a faraway dream. And now he was just another forgotten shelter dog waiting for a chance that might never come. He allowed himself to remember this at night when the barking subsided and the lights dimmed. He had once had a home, a real home with a warm bed, a backyard to run in, and a person who loved him. He was curled up in his customary location, resting his head on his paws, when he spotted movement outside his kennel one afternoon. At first, he was unaware that something had changed. A man and a lady stood there. He had seen lots such visitors before. Usually they'd stop, gaze into each cage, and then move on, drawn to the younger, more energetic dogs. But these two didn't move on. They were looking at him. He moved his head slightly, but didn't get up. They spoke quietly to the shelter worker. The worker nodded, and a short while later, his cage's latch clicked. It had been a while since he had heard that sound. For the first time in his life, he ventured outdoors after a voice called his name and a leash was placed around his neck. Outside the kennel, the air felt different. Hunter had known only the little room behind metal bars, the smell of disinfection, the sound of dogs howling, and the cold floor for so long that it had become his reality. However, when he stepped outside for the first time, something felt strange, almost overwhelming. The shelter worker gently held the loose leash around his neck and guided him toward the front of the facility. He hesitated for a second once his paws reached the tile floor. Where was he heading? He had previously left his cage, but only for quick strolls on the tiny playground behind the refuge. Each time he was taken straight back to his kennel, the same cramped area that had turned become his prison. However, this time was different, because he could feel the other dogs gaze on him as he passed their kennels. While some whimpered and others barked, the majority merely gazed inquisitively. Hunter continued to walk even though they had previously witnessed other dogs depart. He was guided by the shelter employee down a corridor and to the glass doors at the entrance. He could see sunlight spilling onto the walkway beyond the doors. A nice breeze blew through the trees as cars drove by. It had been so long since he'd genuinely been outside. The couple waited for him by the main desk. The man had a stack of papers, and the woman smiled sweetly, lowering slightly as he approached. Hunter halted. Uncertain, the employee gently pulled the leash. "It's okay, buddy," the man stated in a steady, quiet voice. Hunter studied them, blinking. Many people had passed his cage without giving it a second look, but these two had stopped and were now escorting him somewhere. Hunter stood, motionless, unsure of what to do, when the employee gave him the leash. He hesitated, then carefully lowered his head as the woman extended her hand for him to sniff. As he inhaled her aroma, his nose quivered. She had a distinct scent from the shelter staff, like lavender, and a warm, comforting scent. "You're coming." "Home with us," the woman whispered, her smile widening. "Home?" Hunter's heart pounded at the sound of that phrase. He had nearly forgotten what it meant. After the man completing the documents, the shelter employee moved aside. Hunter was suddenly no longer a shelter dog. As the couple escorted him to the doors, the outside world appeared to be unnaturally vast. Sunlight struck his fur, causing him to squint slightly due to the brightness. The city's noises were more intense than he had recalled. Birds chirping, cars talking. Then he noticed the vehicle. Hunter hesitated, his muscles tight as the woman gestured for him to jump in through the rear door. An old memory came to mind. It had not gone well the last time he had been in a car. The man knelt next to him and softly rubbed his back, his hesitancy must have been evident on his face. His words, "It's okay, buddy," were repeated. Every day people passed his cell while he waited for years behind those cold metal bars. Their faces lit up as they picked out puppies. Ecstatic voices filled the air, papers were signed, and tails wagged as dogs left with their new family. But no one ever stopped for him. One day, after he had given up, a couple showed up in front of his kennel and looked directly at him. At first, he thought they were curious but uninterested like everyone else. But then he noticed something odd. They gestured in his direction. He knew he was heading home when the worker nodded and the paperwork was signed. But no one saw what would happen next. The amount of time Hunter had spent in that haven had slipped his mind. Weeks, months, and what felt like an eternity passed after the seemingly swift days. At first, he had been hopeful. Every time someone walked into the adoption area, he would jump up, wag his tail, and press his nose on the metal bars. He wished and prayed that this would be the day, but it was never. He stayed, but too many dogs had come and gone, each leaving with a new family. Small breeds, lively puppies, and even some older canines were chosen before him. He had done everything he could to draw attention. He attempted but failed to bark like the younger dogs. Additionally, he attempted to sit quietly and gaze up with pleading eyes, but that too failed. At last, he simply gave up trying. He scarcely looked up when people went by now. What was the purpose? The concrete floors were usually cold, the air smelled like disinfectant, and the shelter was a raucous, chaotic place where dogs were constantly barking. Volunteers came and went to feed them, clean their cages, and sometimes take them for short trips outside, but Hunter never felt free. His food bowl was constantly full, but the kibble was dry and bland. His cage was tiny, hardly big enough for him to spin around in. Other than when a staff member stopped by to stroke behind his ears, he seldom ever felt warm. He was now just another abandoned shelter dog waiting for a chance that might never come, but that was another existence, a distant dream. At night, when the lights dropped and the barking stopped, he let himself remember this. There was a time when he had a home, a true home, with a cozy bed, a backyard for running, and someone who cared for him. One afternoon, he was lying in his usual spot, head resting on his paws, when he noticed someone moving outside his kennel. He didn't realize at first that something had changed. There stood a man and a woman. He had already seen several such guests. Usually they would pause to look at each cage before continuing on, attracted to the younger, more active canines. However, these two continued to stare at him. He made a small head movement, but remained motionless. They conversed with the shelter employee in a low voice. The worker nodded, and a moment later the clasp of his cage clicked. He hadn't heard that sound in a long time. A voice shouted his name, and a leash was put around his neck, and he went outside for the first time in his life. The air outside the kennel was different. For so long, Hunter had only ever known the little space behind metal bars, the chilly floor, the sound of dogs howling, and the scent of disinfectant. But as he went outside for the first time, he experienced an odd, almost overwhelming feeling. The shelter employee led him to the front of the building while gently securing the slack leash around his neck. When his paws touched the tile floor, he paused for a moment. Where was he going? The only time he had left his cage was to take short walks on the small playground behind the refuge. Every time he was immediately returned to his kennel, the same small space that had become his jail. He could sense the other dogs' eyes on him as he passed their kennels, though, so this time was different. Some barked and some whimpered, but most just stared curiously. Even though they had seen other dogs leave before, Hunter kept walking. The shelter staff led him down a hallway to the glass doors at the front door. Beyond the doors, he could see sunlight flooding onto the walkway. Cars passed past, and a pleasant breeze flowed through the trees. He hadn't actually been outside in such a long time. By the main counter, the pair waited for him. The woman smiled pleasantly and lowered her head slightly as the man approached with a stack of papers. Hunter stopped. The worker tugged the leash tentatively. "It's okay, buddy," the man said quietly and steadily. Hunter blinked as he examined them. His cage had been passed by many without a second glance, but these two had paused and were now taking him somewhere. When the staffer handed Hunter the leash, he remained there, not knowing what to do. The woman held out her palm for him to sniff, and he paused before slowly lowering his head. His nose trembled as he breathed in her scent. She smelled different from the shelter staff, warm and pleasant, like lavender. The woman said, "You're coming home with us," as her smile grew. Home? Hunter had almost forgotten what that term meant, and the sound of it made his heart race. The shelter employee stepped aside once the man had finished filling out the paperwork. All of a sudden, Hunter was no longer a shelter dog. The outer world seemed unreasonably large as the duo led him to the entrance. He squinted slightly at the brightness of the sunlight on his fur. The sounds of the city were louder than he remembered. Cars conversing, birds chirping, and then he saw the car. The woman motioned for Hunter to leap in via the back door, but he paused, his muscles tense. It reminded me of an old recollection. The previous time he had been in a car, it had not gone well. His hesitation may have been shown on his face, because the man knelt beside him and gently caressed his back. He said, "It's okay, buddy," and he said it again. As he waited for years behind those icy metal bars, people passed his cell every day. As they selected puppies, their expressions brightened. As canines departed with their new family, papers were signed, tails wagged, and ecstatic voices filled the air, but nobody ever paused for him. A couple appeared in front of his kennel one day after he had given up, and they gave him a direct look. He initially assumed they were interested but indifferent like everyone else. But then he noticed something strange. They pointed at him. When the employee nodded and the documents were signed, he knew he was going home. However, few anticipated what would come next. Hunter had forgotten how long he had been in that sanctuary. After the days that seemed to go by quickly, weeks, months, and what seemed like an eternity passed. He had been hopeful at first. He would jump up, wag his tail, and put his nose against the metal bars whenever someone entered the adoption area. Though he prayed and hoped that today would be the day, it never came. Too many dogs had come and gone, each taking a new family with them, but he stayed. Prior to him, small breeds, energetic puppies, and even some older dogs were selected. He had made every effort to attract notice. He tried to bark like the younger dogs, but was unsuccessful. He also tried sitting quietly and looking up with beseeching eyes, but it didn't work either. Finally, he just stopped trying. By now, he hardly looked up when people left. What was the objective? The shelter was a noisy, chaotic environment, where dogs were often barking, the concrete floors were typically cold, and the air had a disinfectant odor. Hunter never felt free, even though volunteers came and went to feed them, clean their cages, and occasionally take them outside for brief excursions. The kibble was tasteless and dry, but his feeding bowl was always filled. He was hardly able to whirl around in his small cage. He rarely felt warm, except when a staff member came by to rub behind his ears. He was now merely another stray dog, from a shelter, hoping for a chance that could never materialize. But that was a different life, a far-off dream. He allowed himself to remember this at night when the lights went out and the barking ceased. He once had a home, a real home, complete, with a comfortable bed, a running yard, and a caregiver. He saw someone moving outside his kennel one afternoon when he was lying in his customary position with his head resting on his paws. At first he was unaware that something had changed. A woman and a man were standing there. He has seen a number of such visitors before. Usually, drawn to the younger, more energetic dogs, they would stop to inspect each cage before moving on. But these two kept their eyes on him. He moved his head slightly, but did not move. They spoke softly to the shelter staff member. The worker gave a nod, and then his cage's clasp clicked. It had been a while since he had heard that sound. For the first time in his life, he stepped outdoors after a voice called his name, and a leash was fastened around his neck. Outside the kennel, the air was different. Hunter had known nothing except the small room behind the metal bars, the cold floor, the howling of dogs, and the smell of disinfectant for so long. However, he felt a strange, almost overwhelming sensation when he stepped outside for the first time. As she carefully fastened the loose leash around his neck, the shelter staff escorted him to the front of the structure. He hesitated for a second when his paws made contact with the tile floor. What was his destination? He had only ever stepped out of his cage to go for quick walks on the little playground behind the shelter. Each time, he was sent right back to his kennel, the same cramped place that had served as his prison. However, this time was different because he could feel the other dogs' gazes on him as he passed their kennels. While some whined and others barked, the majority merely gazed inquisitively. Hunter continued to walk, despite the fact that they had previously witnessed other canines depart. He was guided by the shelter workers down a corridor to the main doors, glass doors. He could see sunlight spilling onto the sidewalk outside the doors. A cool breeze blew through the trees as cars drove by. It had been so long since he had gone outside. The two waited for him by the main counter. The man came with a pile of papers, and the woman bent her head a little and smiled sweetly. Hunter came to a stop. With hesitation, the worker pulled on the leash. "It's okay, buddy," he said steadily and quietly. Hunter studied them, blinking. Many people had passed his cage without giving it a second look, but these two had stopped and were now escorting him somewhere. Hunter stood there, unsure of what to do, until the worker gave him the leash. He hesitated, then lowered his head gently as the woman reached out her palm for him to sniff. As he inhaled her aroma, his nose quivered. She had a warm, sweet, lavender-like scent that set her apart from the shelter staff. "You're coming home with us," the woman added, her smile widening. "Home?" The sound of that name made Hunter's heart race, and he had nearly forgotten what it meant. When the man had completed the paperwork, the shelter staff member moved aside. Hunter was suddenly no longer a shelter dog. As the pair escorted him to the door, the outside world appeared absurdly vast. The sunlight was so bright on his fur that he squinted a little. It was louder than he remembered, the sounds of the metropolis. Birds chirping, cars talking. Then he noticed the vehicle. Hunter hesitated, his muscles tensed, as the woman gestured for him to jump in through the rear door. It brought up a memory from my past. It had not gone well the last time he had been in a car. The man knelt next to him and gave him a gentle back rub. which may have revealed his hesitation. "It's okay, buddy," he said, repeating himself.